So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Chad Forsey. Chad is the Executive Director for the Pennsylvania Conservative Energy Forum, PennCEF. And Chad, go ahead and introduce PennCEF and Mr. Bolger, if you would.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate it. And good afternoon. Again, my name is Chad Forsey, and I am the Executive Director for PennCEF. PennCEF was founded in 2018 when a group of Pennsylvania policymakers, business leaders, and academic leaders got together to create a conservative voice on energy in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We believe in open markets and we believe in free enterprise, and we believe first and foremost in energy diversity. We believe that all of the above is good for all of our citizens. We don't denigrate Pennsylvania's legacy energy industries, but we do believe that clean and renewable sources ought to have equal access to markets. We believe in land rights, and we believe that they are a necessary component of a free and democratic society. Farmers and property owners, we believe, ought to have open access to energy development in Pennsylvania. We believe in economic development and jobs, and these are the hallmarks of our movement. In Pennsylvania, clean energy jobs currently stand at 90,000 plus and are growing at a rate of 6% annually. We believe in national security, and we believe that it must be preserved. More diverse and local energy sources here at home means greater resiliency in the face of foreign attacks or natural disaster, and it means less overseas commitments. Today's event, as John mentioned, is one in a series of events taking place across the country in honor of National Clean Energy Week. And we appreciate NCEW, the Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, and the Conservative Energy Network, our parent organization, for their leadership in this important week. Now I'd like to introduce Glen Bolger. Glen Bolger is one of the Republican Party's leading political strategists and pollsters. He's a partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies, a national political and public affairs survey research firm whose clients include leading political figures, Fortune 500 companies, and major associations. Public Opinion Strategies, or POS, has 11 U.S. senators, 6 governors, and 44 members of Congress currently as clients. Glen is the only pollster to be a 3-time winner of the Republican Pollster of the Year award from the American Association of Political Consultants, winning the prestigious award for his work in 2002, 2009, and 2012. Glen has polled for more winning U.S. congressional candidates than I have time to fully list today. It's an exhaustive list in states across the country, including in Pennsylvania. He has also polled for a high number of successful state legislative candidates, both nationwide and again right here in Pennsylvania. Glen also has the distinction of being the pollster to PennCEF's parent organization, the Conservative Energy Network. Prior to co-founding Public Opinion Strategies, Glen was the director of the Survey Research and Analysis for the National Republican Congressional Committee, which is the political arm of the House Republican Conference. He is a graduate of the American University in Washington, D.C. Glen and his wife Carol have 3 daughters, and Glen's hobbies include travel and travel blogging, kayaking, hiking, and being a sports fan. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Glen Bolger.
Chad, thank you. First question I have is the share screen working?
It should be. It should be. If you click on share screen, you should be able to select.
Okay, sorry. For some reason, my I don't. Okay, now is it working?
Yep, there we go.
Okay, let me get it going here. Thanks. Oh, before I was just thrown off because the view of everybody was not on my screen, so the share screen was missing and stuff. But I have since got it working right. I will say, first of all, Chad and John, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me on today. Second observation is unfortunately, thanks to the coronavirus, the whole you could have left the whole travel and travel blogging part out of my bio, because that hasn't been going on for a number of months now. But I have been kayaking and hiking, and unfortunately, pro sports isn't going too well for my team, so I've been focused on kayaking and hiking. But let me get right to the presentation. And what I'm doing is I'm going to be talking about data from 3 different surveys. One is in Pennsylvania. That's going to be the first part that I cover, a survey that I did for your organization back in February in the 6th House District of Pennsylvania, which is an important district because of who the representative is. And we tested voter attitudes in that district towards clean energy. Then we also, I regularly do a national survey for Clean Energy Network, as you mentioned. And then another, one of my business partners, who also does a lot of work in Pennsylvania, Neil Newhouse, did a survey in June of 2020 online with Republicans and Republican-leaning independents on behalf of Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. That data was made public. So what I've tried to do is blend key parts of all 3 surveys together. So let me start walking you through that. We'll start with attitudes towards solar. Again, this is the Pennsylvania specific part of the data. And we tested solar power's image in this particular House district, 70% favorable, 14% unfavorable. So very solid image, very strong. And it goes across party lines. You can see, as you look at the screen on the left, base Republicans, 53-29, soft Republicans, 73-8, and then independents, 82 favorable, 15 unfavorable to solar power. So, one of the things that's important to note here is, look, Republicans candidates, obviously conservative candidates do really well with the base, but when we have tough elections like we did in 2018 or that we're heading into in 2020, this November, we really need to do well with soft Republicans and independents. And again, you look at the favorability rating of solar power among independents at 82%. You say, wow, that's, does very, very well. And then you look at it by the electorate, you see it's popular with both, by gender and age, it's popular with both men and women. A little bit stronger with women than with men, but it's, mid-60s to mid-70s across genders and across ages. There's no generation gap. There's no difference between younger and older. There's kind of a canard out there that older voters are not as open to solar power and other forms of clean energy. These data underscore that's not the case. We asked whether they favor or oppose increasing the amount of power residents can get from renewable energy sources such as solar and wind. 78% favor that. And again, it's 60% essentially among the base, 80% among the soft, 86% among independents, and then, obviously very high with voters on the left as well. And then we tested HB 531, which is all about allowing community solar project that could be used by multiple homeowners, business owners, and farmers. And that support is 81%, only 15% opposed. You see it pops above 60% with the base, soft and swing voters, very, very supportive of it. And you talked earlier about how you are for an all of the above approach. Well, when we asked, 3 different options and which came closest to their own on energy production, more emphasis on natural gas and revitalizing coal, 13%. More emphasis on developing clean energy sources such as wind and solar, 26%. And then 59% say, look, we should be taking an all of the above energy approach that includes traditional sources like coal, natural gas, clean energy sources like wind and solar. So you can see that's where the majority in this survey were. Then when you look at our getting to the national data, and this is among all voters, we've been testing this since 2016 on a pretty much a regular basis. We did early 2018 rather than 2017, but and we're gearing up to do our next national survey on this. But this shows, this is, you think that as a country, the United States should put more emphasis, less emphasis, or about the same emphasis as it does now on producing domestic energy from each of the following sources. You see wind, more emphasis, 67, less emphasis, only 15%, solar power, 75, 10, and in hydropower, 56, more emphasis, 6 less emphasis. As opposed to some other sources, coal, much more, a majority saying they'd like to see less emphasis. Natural gas is positive at 41.18, and then nuclear power is relatively evenly divided, 32 more emphasis, 34% less emphasis. And what approach to increase clean energy production would they prefer? And this is something that conservatives can easily get behind. And you know, if you look, there's not been, it's actually gotten better. I was going to say not much change, but there has been some change since November of 2018. This past November, approaches that allow markets and businesses to provide more clean energy production, 70% prefer that, 26% prefer government mandates and quotas. So, and by the way, that's obviously a very comfortable approach for conservative candidates and organizations and businesses to take. And then assuming climate change is caused by humans, what do you think is the best way to deal with the issue? Putting, and number one, putting more efforts into research, development, and innovation of clean energy sources comes in at 52%. Increasing market incentives for new technologies, it's half that at 26%. And then stopping the use of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas, only 15% take that perspective. And you'll note that, you know, it's basically, the numbers are relatively even. If you look to the right side of the chart, look at it by party, it's not much difference by party. I mean, you don't see that kind of bipartisan consensus about the importance of research, development, and innovation of clean energy sources on too many issues. You can see it's all in the 50s with everybody. It's the majority for all. Then we tested a series of policies to help expand commitment to clean energy. And, you know, do you favor or oppose that policy? Community renewable projects like solar that enable consumers to share the benefits, 87%. Allow more electric utility competition, which would give people a choice of what company they buy their power from. Again, 87%. And by the way, if you look at the intensity on this, that's the number, the white number in the dark blue, 61%, 58% strongly favor. A good rule of thumb in polling is that anything that gets 30% or higher, either strong favor or strong opposed, voters feel, you know, very strongly about that, obviously. So if you're looking at numbers in the 60s and high 50s, you know, there's huge support levels for this. It's not just, yeah, I kind of think that's a good idea. It's, yeah, that's really a good idea. And you can see the other options that we tested as well. I don't want to, you know, get bogged down on each one of these, but I've had this chart up for a little bit. And then voters are more likely to vote for a candidate who, or elected official or candidates who support clean energy development like solar and wind. 80% say they're more likely, and 14% say they're going to vote against. And look at the intensity, the dark blue, that 43% definitely for compared to only 7% definitely against. Now, climate change, human activity is a little bit more divided, but still 2-to-1, with 61 more likely, 30% less likely. And the reason I show this to you is that when you look at Republicans and independents on this, clean energy support, a candidate who supports clean energy, Republicans by 2-to-1 say they're more likely to vote for that candidate. Independents, it's almost 8-to-1, 79-to-11. On the climate change at the bottom, that's where Republican voters say, you know, hold on a second, that's a bridge too far for them. So again, big difference. I'll go back a page. Big difference between for Republicans in terms of, you know, candidates who support clean energy development like solar and wind. Republicans 2-to-1 supportive of that. Then wrapping this survey, the highlights from this survey up before getting to the final one. And by the way, I'm moving through this, John and Chad, fairly quickly, so we'd be ready for some Q&A here. But protecting property owners' ability to produce energy on their land, 92% say that's very important, including 53% who say, 92% say it's important, including 53% very important. And then protecting property owners' rights to lease their land for renewable energy production, 91%. And the reason we tested this is that something, again, that conservatives can feel very comfortable with, talking about property owner rights, as a building block of clean energy. And so that, that's something else that candidates and organizations who support this and are on the more conservative side gives them something to talk about. So now let's move to the third phase of the research that we've done over the last 10 months or so. And that's the National Survey of Republicans and Republican-oriented independents. We did find that a majority, 54%, consider climate change to be a serious problem. And more importantly, bigger numbers, 76% support federal government taking action to accelerate the development and use of clean energy in the U.S. And again, this isn't, what Republicans or conservatives don't want is they don't want taking sides, but the government taking sides and picking winners and losers. But what they want is policies that allow companies to do well in terms of expanding and accelerating the development and use of clean energy in the United States. We see a much bigger number of Republicans, now up to 72%, supporting the federal government taking steps to reduce emissions of gases like carbon dioxide and methane emissions that contribute to climate change. And that's a significant increase over the last few years. And there's also overwhelming agreement. And again, these are among Republicans and Republican-leaning independents, that accelerating the growth of clean energy in the U.S. can help the country become a world leader for green economic development. And you see 70% agree with that. And among very conservative voters, 60% agree with it. Among somewhat conservative voters, 71% agree with it. And then moderate and liberal, but again, these are Republicans still, and independents who lean Republican, 81%. So big consensus across ideological lines. And then 2/3 of Republicans agree that it's important to make investments in clean energy as part of our effort to rebuild the economy after the coronavirus shutdown. And our polls are consistently finding that Republicans are more concerned about the impact of the coronavirus on the economy than any other voter group. And again, this is seen, clean energy investment is seen as a way to help rebuild the economy. Whether it's very conservative voters at 58%, somewhat at 65%, or 80% of the moderate liberal Republicans. Now, most feel that carbon neutral economy by as soon as 2030 is an unrealistic goal, but it is seen by 2050 as more realistic to Republicans, particularly younger Republicans. And I'm not going to try and say that again because I'm not getting it right today. And there's also a consensus among Republicans, 86% agree that the United States cannot solve the global climate change issue on its own. Other countries need to step up and do their own part. Otherwise, not enough progress will be made. So I know you gave me about a half hour, but I kind of hit the highlights much faster because I wanted to leave more time for Q&A. So I'll turn it back to our hosts, who need to unmute themselves.
You're right. Thank you. These Zoom days, we've got to get used to all the buttons and technology. So thank you, Glenn. You've been a great resource to PennCEF. And there's my dog barking. I apologize.
Look, it wouldn't be Zoom. It wouldn't be Zoom if somebody forgot to unmute the dog in the background. So don't worry about it.
Yeah. So you've been a great resource to PennCEF and to CEN and to others as well. One question I ask, and I remind folks that they could still ask questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of their page. We'll continue to monitor that. But Glenn, based upon the polling that you've done in Pennsylvania, how do the attitudes regarding clean and renewable energy in Pennsylvania compare to the rest of the country?
Relatively similar. The more conservative parts of the country, not surprisingly, are a little bit more skeptical. But a state like Pennsylvania, where it's a very big and diverse state, you have fairly wide range of opinion. But again, most Pennsylvanians support solar power. They support wind energy. They believe that there should be an all of the above approach, as you talked about. They don't think that the Pennsylvania's legacy energy industry should be thrown on the scrap heap, but they also recognize that the future is coming. If you'll allow me to tell a quick story, and it's been a number of years now, but I was doing a campaign for a Republican candidate for governor in another state. The happy news is that they won. But one of our most powerful ads was him talking about, and this was very early in the clean energy discussion, especially for Republicans, where he was talking about he wanted the state to become, a leader in all of the above energy, including wind, including solar, including coal, because I was part of that state's legacy industries as well, and whatever else that they could do. And the candidate, when we tested it, it just scored off the charts. And we were doing our focus groups with independent voters. He said, okay, that's great, I hear you on that, but I'm worried that base Republicans are going to say, no, that we're opposed to clean energy. And so I actually had to do, in a general election, a couple of focus groups testing the ad with base Republicans. And they all said the same thing. They all said, look, if you say we can only go to clean energy, that's crazy. But the clean energy is the future. This is going to happen. And our state might as well be a major part of that. I think Pennsylvania conservatives feel the same way, which is, look, we're not ready to scrap and go to 100% clean energy. But boy, we don't want to be left behind either. We know that's the future. It's growing. It's becoming more important. And, I think clean energy has a lot of credibility with conservatives.
Good. Thanks, Glenn. Glenn, we're in an election year in 2020. It's been a year like no other. So, and I don't want to get into that aspect of it, but I would ask you, if you were to advise candidates running for office, Republicans running for office right now, particularly those who have not held legislative seats in the past, how would you advise them, based upon polling, to message on clean and renewable energy?
That's a good question. Before I answer that, I just want to, you mentioned 2020, obviously a year unlike any other. I saw yesterday a photo, being sent around by people, kind of a meme type thing. It was in the discount rack. I couldn't tell, maybe at a Target or, that kind of store. And it was clearly like a diary or something. And it was entitled Best Year Ever, 2020. And that's why, obviously, it was in a discount rack, because nobody was buying that, for a scrapbook. But in terms of how should candidates and campaigns talk about clean energy in this election, look, we as a party, the Republican Party is under challenge from among independents, because the president's pretty controversial. A lot of independents give our candidates lower ratings than they would in another year. Clean energy is a way for them to look and say, oh, okay, this person's not just a typical Republican. There are, other reasons to vote for this candidate. Look, voters appreciate, especially swing voters, appreciate Republicans are good on fiscal issues, whether it's taxes, spending, focusing on creating jobs. Yes, but they're not quite as sure about a lot of other issues. And clean energy is a very credible way to tell swing voters that, this is a candidate who, has a perspective on a lot of different issues and isn't just kind of a typical Republican who doesn't care about people, which is how Democrats like to paint Republican candidates. So I think that's one of the reasons that it's very important, is a signal to swing voters.
Good. Another question that we have is the data that you're giving is trending over time. How do you see the pace of the change or the increase for support increasing over the time that you've been polling on this particular issue?
We've seen it among more conservative voters. It's increasing. There's no question about it. Particularly something like solar. But one caveat is if you've noticed, President Trump has occasionally said disparaging things about wind energy. Not quite sure why. I don't know the background behind that, but he's not a fan of wind. And I have noticed in the polling that among Republicans that support for wind energy has dropped a bit. So that may that may change, but that's something that is definitely out there. But for the most part, in terms of community solar, for example, that's support for that keeps going up. Just all those different options you see among Republicans and conservative-leaning independents. We've seen a pretty steady increase over the last 5-6 years.
Glenn, from the recent polling you've done, do you see clean energy as being a major discussion in the upcoming election, both for top and down ballot races?
I'm not sure you're going to want to hear my answer, but no, not really. I mean, part of it, I think, again, it's an important way of validating to swing voters that for a candidate, yeah, that I hear you, but in terms of it being a vote deciding issue in 2020, odds of that are very low. Certainly there may be some voters, but coronavirus, jobs in the economy, the Supreme Court, how things are going in my neck of the, my area, my region or my state or my county, those, how do we get kids back to school? Those are the kinds of issues that voters are focused on. Obviously, healthcare as well. That doesn't mean that clean energy is not going to come back as an issue after 2020. I think it will, and I think it's one of those things that, again, it makes sense to have part of your issue agenda, but just recognize in terms of the voters who are going to be voting on that issue. It's going to be a relatively low number in 2020, partly, or not part, well, to an extent, obviously, because of coronavirus and all the effects that's having.
Just a piece of information, because we've had this question. We are recording the webinar today. And Glenn, one question is, would you be able to share your slide deck with us so that we could post it on our social media page?
I'd be happy to.
Okay. So once Glenn sends that to PennCEF, we will post it on the PennCEF Facebook page. Please be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and all of those good other social media sources. So Glenn, next question. In your polling, do you disaggregate your data by age group? And if so, which age groups are most looking favorably on clean and renewable energy. And I'm particularly interested in the data from millennials who are going to become the majority voters in the future.
Well, what you see is pretty widespread support across age groups, but not surprisingly, younger voters are more supportive in general of clean energy. Good support overall. I don't want you thinking seniors are opposed. They're very supportive, but when you look at most questions, the highest support comes from younger voters. And by the way, 18 to 34-year-olds, for example, they include both millennials and Generation Z as well. It's amazing how quickly generations turn over. Millennials are no longer the youngest part of the electorate, but they are a major part, as you mentioned, a large part, and they're getting larger, through the years. Not because their share is growing, but because other shares are getting smaller. It is a good strategy for conservative candidates. And keep in mind, politically, conservative candidates do much better with older voters and not that well with younger voters. That underscores that kind of getting back into the game with those younger voters, clean energy will help do that.
Good, thank you. We do have some questions that are specific to policy issues in Pennsylvania, and we will answer those. It looks like we'll have time.
But I won't.
Right, you won't. We are going to get to that. But there are questions regarding incentives, Glenn, for clean and renewable, whether that be tax credits or subsidies. Does your polling, have you picked up on Republican support for whether there should be government incentives for clean and renewable energy, or should market forces dictate how that moves forward?
In general, they prefer market force. Voters, Republicans prefer market forces, but there is support for incentives. The concern, of course, is going back to some of the horror stories like Solyndra, that still, believe it or not, comes up in the polling, where government's playing favorites. Again, for the most part, and I'm not sure if my share screen is still on or not, but for the most part, Republicans would prefer a focus on R&D and innovation of clean energy sources, and prefer government not to play favorites. If it seems something is leveling the playing field, that's different in terms of making it across the board, not playing favorites. I think that's different in terms of how Republicans feel.
So Glenn, you've done some Pennsylvania polling for us. You've done national polling, which shows broad-based support for being clean and renewable friendly, diversification of energy and all of that. And this might be speculation on your part, anecdotal on your part, or your conversation with legislators. With that broad-based support, why is there still resistance on this issue among Republicans?
The challenge is there's more resistance among Republican office holders than there are among Republican voters per se. And I think that there's an easy explanation, and it's not necessarily one that folks on this Zoom are going to want to hear, but Republican office holders don't feel like the issue helps them in primaries. They don't think it helped them win a primary. They don't think it would help them even in a general election. Although the data I showed earlier suggests that's just not the case. That it is very helpful in a general election. But in terms of what does the base think about it? you saw that the base in the data is supportive, but not as strongly supportive as swing voters. So they see it as more of a November issue than they see it as a, whenever the primary is, in, an April or May issue, for instance. You probably receive your strongest support for clean energy among Republican legislators from those who are in more swing districts than those who are in, relatively safe Republican districts. Because the swing district candidates, they look at this and say, oh, this is another arrow in my quiver to help me win a general election. Those in, the Republicans in more conservative, safe districts, I should say, more safe districts, they look at this and say, I don't know if this helps me that much. And if I'm too far out in front, it may end up costing me. Data argues otherwise, but, politicians can be very reactive to anecdotes and what have you. And, if they talk to one person at a meeting who said, oh, this clean energy stuff, this is, terrible, they're going to be like, oh, that's how all of my base feels. So that's kind of what's going on there.
Yeah. Glenn, have you polled on the Green New Deal? And if so, what are you hearing among the public and the legislators regarding that?
That's a good question. Yes, although it's kind of fallen off the front burner, the Green New Deal. It's not been as hot topic in the last few months for several different reasons. One is Democratic office holders, are backing off or have stayed away from it, other than those who are in the most liberal type districts where they know it's not going to, support for it is not going to hurt them. So that's, so taking a lower profile. But when we test elements of it, kind of the most outlandish elements of it, it certainly is something that voters are very skeptical of. Again, but by the way, I'm sorry, I should have gone with this first when I started talking about how voters feel about it. When they hear the term Green New Deal, they receive it very favorably. So if you're a Republican running against a candidate who supports it and you're saying, my opponent supports the Green New Deal, if that's all they hear about it, there's going to be a lot of voters who say, well, that sounds pretty good. So you have to go a little bit further and identify what that all means and what, support for that, ends up with in terms of costing, jobs, in terms of higher taxes, in terms of no more use of, this type of technology and, guaranteed universal basic income, whether you work or not. I mean, all those elements are very unpopular, but, they chose Green New Deal. AOC and others chose the term Green New Deal for a reason, which is, yeah, that sounds pretty good. The last New Deal worked pretty well, so this sounds good too.
Yeah, good. So going back to what you said about clean and renewables not being a major discussion in 2020 among the electorate. Could you speculate or perhaps have data that as the voters, particularly millennials, get older and are motivated to participate more in politics, do you see this becoming more of a front burner issue?
Yeah, I do. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, it's subsumed by coronavirus and all of those, ripple effects from that. But certainly, as climate change becomes more of a topic of discussion, and it's obviously a major one now, but becomes even more of one. It's certainly, climate change. Clean energy obviously is the #1 way to deal with that issue. One challenge obviously facing Republican candidates is, as from the data I showed earlier, Republican voters are skeptical that human climate change, or human caused climate change is happening. Acceptance of that, belief in that is rising, but it's still, rising kind of slowly.
Right. So there's a question, and it's kind of, I don't know if they're questioning the legitimacy of polling or not, but I'll just ask it as it's being presented. It says, support in polls is often gauged on brief sound bites or concepts, but as we know, devil's in the details. Poll questions are often 2 and 3 sentences. Actual policy can be multiple lengthy pages. Is it fair to conclude that some of the disparity between poll respondents and elected officials is one that one is responding to a brief description, in other words, the 2 and 3 sentences, and the other on evaluating the substance of real world details? Long question, but.
That's a good question. Look, in terms of polls, not getting as much into the details, there's certainly, we went into quite a bit of detail in each of these 3 surveys. I didn't show you every question and result that was asked. Otherwise, I'd still be talking about that as opposed to us having moved on to the Q&A. That's observation number 1. Observation number 2 is, look, voters, that's why they vote for elected officials. Early on in my polling career, I was brought in to do some projects where, what ideas do voters have? Well, it turns out, on issues, they don't have a lot. Now, that's why they elect elected officials. That's why they vote for people, is you handle these problems. So they don't really focus on that. They have more important things going on, like can the Eagles rebound from being 0-2? Is the Steelers defense as good as the one back in 2008? So they're focused on important stuff, not always, the details. They have a life to live. They have family to raise. They have jobs. They have, other interests. They have hobbies. They're hunting. They're going to church. They're not always focused on this. They're involved in, community organizations. That noted, I don't know that I would consider every elected official an expert on every issue. They tend to have areas of expertise or things that, because of the committees they're on, they really follow closely. But there are other things that they're hearing sound bites as well. So I would not overestimate the policy grasp of elected officials on it.
Yeah. So let me deal with a Pennsylvania specific issue that you polled on for us. The poll that you mentioned that we did back in February of this year, we specifically wanted to gain understanding of support for cleaner renewables generally, but community solar in particular. And your polling, and Chad, I'm going to let you speak up on this as well, if you would, but the polling that you did and how we used it has actually helped us to have some leverage on this particular issue. So some people wonder, why do we do polling? Why do we spend thousands, tens of thousands of dollars on polling? Well, here's a case in point where it has made a difference. So Chad, why don't you respond to that? And you might want to bring Glenn into that answer as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the good news is, and Glenn had led off today with the poll results from Pennsylvania. Those poll results were from 2 counties in northwestern PA, and they were selected because those counties are also the counties where the chair of our Consumer Affairs Committee, Representative Brad Roy, has his district. And So the poll numbers from that district demonstrated that significantly high percentage, 81% of his constituents were supportive of community solar legislation. And for those who don't know, and I hope most people on the call do, but if you don't, community solar is a pretty simple concept. It allows for multiple owners of a single solar project, and this could be on a farm or on a private land or residential property. And because of that unique ownership and then co-benefiting from the project, the folks who are putting up that project are also able to access better forms of financing. So it's a way that we say it democratizes access to homegrown solar in Pennsylvania. It's a really great bill, and we're working hard to support it. So that poll that Glenn ran up in those two counties in Erie and Crawford County, that gave us a wealth of information to share with Representative Roy. And I'm not gonna say that that he came on board overnight, but over time, what we saw with Chairman Roy was more interest and willingness to have the conversation. More recently, he held hearings, and trust me, the House Consumer Affairs Committee in Pennsylvania isn't known for holding a lot of hearings at all. And he held hearings on the community solar bill. I had the opportunity to testify. So did Leslie Elder from Coalition for Community Solar Access. And that generated some great press. We had far more Republican participation in that hearing than we had on the Democrat side, which was good because they asked good substantive questions. We believe that those hearings really helped to propel that legislation forward. And frankly, the polling has a lot to do with that, because we believe that helped to convince Representative Roy that the legislation was viable, that it was supported, and that it would do good things for our economy. So hopefully that wasn't too long of an answer. But Glenn, anything additionally you wanted to throw in, I'll pitch it to you. But just to reiterate that we thought that the poll was really useful and helpful in sort of fleshing out the viability of community solar in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I think what you see is that for some elected officials, hearing, what the public thinks is, I need to take a second look at this. And as you said, it didn't automatically change his mind. And obviously, I should say, I wasn't in on those meetings. You all were, but you said that he's become more receptive to it over time. And I think that's a good example of where the surveys caused him to think, let me kind of look into this a little bit more and think about this.
Yeah. Just to conclude with about community solar, because somebody asked, how can we support this? It's House Bill 531. There has been committee hearings on it. We do need to convince the Republican leadership, particularly Chairman Roy of Consumer Affairs Committee, to hold a vote on it. We have a pretty good indication that if he allows a vote, it will go through committee, based upon the fact that most of the Republicans, with the exception of one or two, are actually co-sponsors of it. There's very strong bipartisan support for this in the House of Representatives. There is a mirror bill in the state Senate that we believe, if the Republicans pass this, it will easily get through the Senate. So the question was, how can we support this? It would be to contact your local state House member at this point, asking that they ask Chairman Roy for a vote in the Consumer Affairs Committee on House Bill 531, Community Solar, and also ask them to support the bill when it comes to the floor. And Chad, just one last thing, if you could briefly, what do we see now as the timeline on this particular legislation in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so we are hoping that we can get a vote soon in the committee in the House, which would then bring the bill to the floor. We would like to see this to happen sometime in the month of October, optimally, and then get it to the Senate so that it can be acted on prior to the end of the session. Now, that said, and we do run out of session days pretty quickly in October. Of course, we have a big election in November. After that, will we see a lame duck session, as they're known? I think there's a good chance that we will, although this is not resolved at this point by any means. And the official word from House and Senate Republican leadership is that they don't do lame duck sessions, but we have seen them in the past, and this would be a year due to the budget difficulties
Right.
that we would expect. If it's going to happen any year, it'd be this year. And if there is a lame duck session, I would anticipate that would be the time to wrap up community solar. But like I said, we'd prefer to see it acted on prior to that point. It's really important that we get it passed in 2020.
Yeah, it is, Chad. And Glenn, I have one more question for you, and then I know you have another obligation to go to. But if community solar bill, we talk with industry leaders, and there is, and this is not an exaggeration, they're waiting to spend $2 billion in Pennsylvania. There are those, even Pennsylvania-based companies, that have told us if this legislation does not pass in 2020, because they've been waiting for years for it, they're going to go and spend their money in New York and New Jersey and Maryland, where the landscape is more friendly toward solar energy. So Glenn, last question for you. Working backwards from some of the earlier questions, do you think candidates who just outright oppose renewables or actions on climate change, that will work against them in the current and the coming elections, say 2022 and beyond?
It depends on the kind of seats. If it's a relatively, pretty conservative seat, no, probably not. If it is a swing seat, a competitive seat, and keep in mind, we're headed towards redistricting. So people who have certain types of seats now may not have those seats in the future. They may find their seat a little bit more competitive. And I think that's, basically, if I were advising a state organization, my target list would be to take, among Republicans, would be to look at the most competitive races, most competitive seats, and start with them and work your way down until you kind of hit a wall where they're like, nope, not interested. That wall is going to get lower and lower into the future as more younger candidates run, and more and millennials become a larger, and Generation Z becomes a larger part of the electorate, or more important part of the electorate. I mean, they're important now; every voter is, but that's how I foresee things in the future.
Okay, great. Glenn, you're a wealth of information. You're a great resource to us. And if you get me your slide deck, we will go ahead and put that on our social media, particularly our Facebook page, and make that accessible. The recording of this town hall will also be there. And even though Glenn is leaving, there are some Pennsylvania specific questions that Chad and I will get to. One of the questions, Chad, and I'll start to answer and I'll let you chime in, what had to do with incentives for clean and renewables. And I'll tell you, PennCEF, as conservative is in our name. So, we do believe in market forces, and ideally, we'd love to see all energy sources stand alone on their own merits without incentives. So currently, there is a federal tax credit that does have a sunset in the next year or so for those who wish to install solar. There's XREX credits in Pennsylvania. That's very low right now. So Chad, any other incentive? Oh, the other one would be the alternative portfolio standard. That's pretty low in Pennsylvania right now. There are some considerations to raising that. PennCEF really believes, again, that market forces, not government percentages, should drive whether or not solar has a bigger place in the energy portfolio, and wind and other sources as well. So Chad, do you want to speak to incentives in Pennsylvania? You have to unmute yourself.
Yep. Okay, I think I'm on now. Yeah, so I think in Pennsylvania, it's important to bear in mind that first of all, I would say that the community solar legislation would be a significant form of incentive. Now, I'm not speaking of a of a cash incentive here. I'm talking about the incentive that happens when you cut red tape and open up new markets. So as conservatives, we look for opportunities like this all the time. How can we get government out of the way so that development can happen, so that people can take advantage of the blessings of their land, farmers, business owners, landowners, residential property owners, can take advantage of that land and maximize the investments in that land, particularly in such a great technology like solar, like wind, like biomass. So, I think that's kind of how we typically look at incentives in Pennsylvania as conservatives. There certainly is legislation, as John mentioned, the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards piece. There's a legislation piece of legislation right now that would extend that by an additional year. We have not taken a position on this type of bill in the past, and probably won't do that in the future. Although we're happy to talk to folks, who are in the industry that have a different point of view on that. We're always willing to talk about it. But I think that as a general rule, we're looking for incentives that are going to not hit the taxpayers or mandate certain things, because we believe that when you get government out of the way, you generally are going to foster better development. And the big problem in Pennsylvania, frankly, is we have too much government in the way of development. There was a question also on the table about local government rules that get in the way. And, John and we talk about this all the time, that we do see a problem in Pennsylvania with local governments that are, for instance, preventing solar development on farmland, which we believe is a violation of our state's right to farm law. They are, in some cases, they're just voting against a solar project. And in some cases, these are really big solar projects that we're talking about. And we do intend, we're active on the acre piece right now with respect to farm use, and we intend to get more active in the near future. I'll give a little advertisement. There's an organization called the Land and Liberty Coalition that we support that is backed up by the Conservative Energy Network, and Pennsylvania is looking to get involved from PennCEF to bring land and liberty into PA and to start to tackle some of these siting problems and challenges that we have that get in the way of more renewable energy development on land. So you can stay tuned as we look to the future to engage on that issue.
Thanks, Chad. And Chad, we're gonna start to wrap things up right now. There was one question earlier regarding EVs, electric vehicles in Pennsylvania, and I'm gonna just briefly say something. I'll let you turn it over to you to conclude the answer, and then you can go ahead and wrap up the town hall. But EVs currently make up about 2 to 3%, closer to 2% of the vehicles on the road in Pennsylvania. Indications are, with the advancement of Tesla, even Volkswagen announcing this week they're coming out with a completely electric vehicle, and other startups, that will increase dramatically over the coming years. The biggest thing right now in Pennsylvania is we need to begin to support the creation of an infrastructure to support the increase of EVs. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chad.
Yeah, thanks, John. So, and I'm going to unmute myself, I guess. No, I'm unmuted. So real quick, Senator Bob Mensch is a friend of ours, Berks County, parts of Montgomery County, and has introduced a bill, Senate Bill 596, that would create some infrastructure planning for electric vehicles in Pennsylvania. That's really much needed planning, because there are some real questions out there. There are questions about about road use, about access to charging stations, about road capacity. There are questions about taxation and how we pay for our roads, and that's primarily in Pennsylvania through the gas tax. So what about increased EV use? So these questions need to be answered. There's some state planning that needs to take place that hasn't taken place, that frankly has taken place in some of our neighboring states. So to bring Pennsylvania up to speed on this, Bob Mensch introduced Senate Bill 596, which we have endorsed and a number of other organizations have endorsed. And we'd like to see that bill receive a hearing in Brad Roy's Consumer Affairs Committee. We've asked him for a hearing. We know there are a number of other groups that are asking for that as well. And as we know, limited time left in the session to get to that bill and to get to community solar. So we hope folks keep the pressure on. One other question I had that I wanted to very briefly address was about the applicability of the survey of our poll in Erie and Crawford counties to other parts of the state, such as central Pennsylvania. Briefly, just a couple of points. We know that Erie and Crawford counties are more blue collar than typical counties in central PA. And so I would say this: if we got 81% support in the deeply blue collar counties of Erie and Crawford, I can imagine, and I'll jump out on a limb here and say that I'm willing to bet that we would even have potentially higher numbers in the more suburban counties like Cumberland, York, and Dauphin, to name a few. So in other words, when we see numbers like that are that high coming out of counties that had traditional industrial jobs that were the name of the game, it's exciting to think how much more support we're going to have elsewhere. And I think it bodes well for the future of these technologies in Pennsylvania. And with that, I'd like to wrap it up. I'd like to thank everybody for coming on today, being a part of our town hall with Glen Bolger. We were proud to have Glen on. Glen's a national leader in polling and in Republican polling in particular. He's been featured on cable channels like C-SPAN and Fox News and MSNBC and others. So I think it was great for us to have him here today. Very happy to have him as our pollster with the Conservative Energy Network. As you can see, our contact information is on the screen. For John and I, you can email us. You can also find us on PennCEF.org, and our social media information is there as well. Please come on and like us on our social media and check out our website. It's a lot of great content for you to enjoy. And also, I'd like to mention that we have another town hall coming up next Tuesday at 11 a.m. We're going to be talking about national security, which is one of our core reasons for supporting all of the above on energy. And that town hall will feature Dr. John Lehman. And John Lehman is a former U.S. Navy Secretary, member of the 9/11 Commission, a former National Security Council aide to Henry Kissinger. He's had an incredible career in Washington, D.C. in the United States Navy. He served in Vietnam. And he is somebody who is passionate about all of the above on energy. He's passionate about natural gas, and he's particularly passionate about renewables. So we're excited to have Dr. Lehman with us next Tuesday at 11 a.m. And you can go onto our Facebook page and get information on there to sign up and be a part of this. And you should have also received some emails from us with that information as well. But we hope you can join us next Tuesday for a very interesting dive into the connections between Pennsylvania's energy footprint and national security. Again, thank you for coming out and supporting us today and being a part of our town hall. We appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.